Okay, hello everyone. I'm just switching over to gallery view to see faces. Good morning. I hope you survived the obsessive election watching that I keep hearing everyone talk about. Before we begin today, I'd like to first acknowledge that UBC's Point Grey campus is situated on the ancestral unceded territory of the Musqueam people, and I'd also like to acknowledge that you're joining us from many places, near and far, and so acknowledge the traditional owners and caretakers of those lands. We're going to do something different today. We offered all guests this year the opportunity to speak in conventional formats or to use alternatives. And Claire Jean Kim was one of the few people to choose the alternative, happily. And so I'd like to introduce our illustrious guest. Professor Claire Jean Kim has had quite a bit of experience on the topics today. If you've ever caught any of her very cogent exchanges on venues such as PBS or The Nation, LA Times, and well beyond. But I want to say a few things about her work by way of introduction. She's professor of political science and Asian American studies at the University of California, Irvine. Students and myself were drawn to her work and invited her to speak today precisely because she's looked so deeply and with so much intellectual honesty at interracial Asian American and communities of color politics in the US. She knows and has ties to Vancouver and Canada more broadly, as we just learned. And importantly, her work has done everything from trying to kind of unpack Black nationalist and Haitian boycotts of Korean grocers in Brooklyn, Flatbush neighborhood, to be particular. That was her dissertation work at Yale. And through to quite a bit of writing on taxonomies of species and race, you know, deep look into the Harvard and San Francisco school system and the debates about affirmative action and admissions policies. And her books are frankly must read, in particular, her early Bitter Fruit, The Politics of Black Korean Conflict in New York City, that's Yale University Press, and more recently, Dangerous Crossings, Race, Species, and Nature in a Multicultural Age, that Cambridge University Press book in 2015. And she's going to tell us probably a bit about the newest book she's working on. But above all else, welcome, Claire.
Thank you so much, Terry. Thanks to all of you for tuning in today. And I opted for the less conventional format because I thought with all the isolation and stress we're under for various reasons, this might feel a little more user-friendly to have it be more conversational. So Terry,
Shall I jump in?
Okay.
We've been passing questions back and forth, and they're fairly open. So we'll do the usual format of something like, 30 minutes of this and then opening it to the floor. And a couple of, quite a few students sent in questions early. So I'll start with the first two of those when we switch over to the house and take it from there. So Claire, just by way of beginning, we'd love to hear any thoughts on the kind of intellectual journey you have traveled on from the early work in Bitter Fruit through to these tense conversations and conflicts on animal uses and everything from dogfighting to macaw whaling and live markets, the intersection of those two things that crosses a lot of your work. Do you want to start there?
Sure.
Just
so
your ideas?
I thought I'd start with the selection of my dissertation topic, which ended up being this study on Black Korean conflict in New York City, because I was at sort of an impasse and I didn't know what to do the dissertation on. And I was sitting in the lobby of the political science building, and one of the faculty came through with a copy of the New York Times for that day, and he threw it like on the chair next to me and said, "Why don't you do something on that?" And the story in the New York Times was on this conflict between Korean grocers and Black nationalists and Haitian activists in New York. So I said, why not? And I moved to New York and started interviewing and people, and that turned into my dissertation and my first book. So the story being, the sort of lesson being, if you don't know what to do your dissertation on, just go sit in the lobby of a apartment building and maybe someone will give you an idea. But it just sort of goes to show there's a lot of contingency that goes into scholars' intellectual trajectories, right? So once that book came out, the thrust of that book was to theorize the relative positionality of Asians and Blacks in the U.S. Racial order. And so I came up with certain ideas about that in that book. And then once that book came out, for a number of years, I was, identified as a race scholar, considered myself a race scholar. And then through some personal relationships with animals, in particular, a particular cat and a particular horse, and I can go into that in more detail if you're interested. Because of those relationships, I became interested in animal liberation. And so I started to read about it. I developed a undergraduate class on it. And I wanted to integrate it into my work. And what I saw as a race scholar very quickly was that the idea of power, creating certain kinds of classification systems or taxonomies for the purposes of delineating who has worth and who has no worth, right? That was something that was going on with race, but also going on with species. And so you could look at human supremacy and white supremacy as connected in certain ways. Both being expressions of power, right, and expressions of domination. So looking at that kind of intersection of race and species, I became interested in some of the controversies that were going on in the US about how racialized groups used animals in their cultural traditions. So I picked three. The main case was was in San Francisco's Chinatown, which is the oldest Chinatown in the US, where Chinese immigrants buy and sell live animals in live animal markets. So we're talking about turtles, fish, birds primarily, other kinds of more exotic animals as well. And then the comparative cases were the Michael Vick dogfighting case. Michael Vick was an NFL quarterback for the Atlanta Falcons who was Black, who was found guilty of running a dogfighting ring. And then also the macaw whaling in the Pacific Northwest, their attempt to resume whaling after a hiatus of 70 years in the 1990s and the controversy that engendered. So that was that book. And then as I was writing that book, which I finished in 2014, I realized I wasn't quite done with the Afro-Asian theme, which the first book had dealt with. And what I wanted to do, since the intervening event had been that I started to read critical Black studies more seriously. So I read a number of really important works that influenced my thinking, and I wanted to go back to the Afro-Asian theme and revisit that. So I went back and sort of took the theory of racial triangulation I had laid out in that first book, Bitter Fruit, and I'm revising that now for the book that I'm finishing in 3 or 4 months called Asian Americans in an Anti-Black World. And that book is really trying to look at, revisit, rethink Asian American history from the 1850s to the present through the lens of structural anti-Blackness. If we take seriously that there is something such as structural anti-Blackness, how does it reshape how we think about the history of Asian Americans? And I think this would also pertain to the history of Latinx people, also the history potentially of indigenous people in the US. So that's sort of where I am right now with this current book. And I've been thinking, of course, about COVID and about Black Lives Matter and all of these related issues. And we have a little bit going on in the US right now. I don't know if you know what I'm referring to, but just a little, a little bit of drama and tension over here, so it seems like there's a lot at stake right now. So if you hear my son yelling from the other room, it might be some kind of resolution to this.
It might be election news.
Long wait.
Really. Do you want to say a little bit more about triangulation and what that means before I go on to my next question, just for those who might not know?
This may happen to you all as scholars, so I'll just say it because it's funny. That was an article I published in 1999, right out of grad school. So it was my first publication, and it turned out to be my most popular publication, right? Which is a little frustrating as you go on in your career.
Yeah.
More people will read the more recent stuff, but people are very hung up on that article. And I think there are ideological reasons why, actually, because it's positing that Asian Americans are positioned in a particular way relative to Blacks and whites, by which I mean they're in between Blacks and whites on an inferior superior scale, but then they're outside or apart from Blacks and whites on an insider outsider scale. So I was trying to capture both the idea of superiority and inferiority with race, but also the idea of insiderness and outsiderness, particularly with Asians. So that became a very popular piece, I think, because it allowed Asian Americanists in the US to say, well, blacks were enslaved, but Asians were ostracized, right? Blacks were enslaved, but Asians were interned or excluded through the Chinese Exclusion Act. So it sort of gave rise to or facilitated a kind of equivalencing between blacks and Asians, which wasn't really the intention, but I think that's how the article has played out. And so in the book I'm writing now, I'm really going back and correcting that idea and really challenging that idea.
Great. I look forward to that revisit, and we may come back to that in any case, implicitly anyway, in some of the other questions. But I know you've also looked carefully, and I've read your piece on the Harvard case and the question of Asian American applicants there. You've also looked at similar things in the San Francisco school system, I know, but I'm not sure people have really know that case or have really grappled with how sort of profoundly this has guided the university's, Harvard's white mandate at the time. Can you speak to that case
Sure.
and
How many of
its
you
role in your own work?
have heard of the Harvard affirmative action case that's been ongoing? Oh, so just a few of you. Okay. In 2014, Ed Bloom, who was a white man who was responsible for the Fisher v. Texas case, challenging affirmative action in that case, he failed in that case. In 2014, he got together, he collected a group of Asian American plaintiffs to challenge Harvard and the University of North Carolina, and subsequently other schools as well, in terms of saying that their affirmative action programs were discriminatory against Asian Americans. So the case went to the district court in Massachusetts, and the district court found in favor of Harvard. However, the purpose of bringing this suit was from the beginning to have this case go to the Supreme Court. And as I'm sure you all have been following, there have been some unconscionable power grabs on the part of the Republican Party that have resulted in appointments to the Supreme Court, which are tilting the court very far to the right, which means that it is very possible that this case, when it reaches the Supreme Court, will be the case that dismantles affirmative action in the United States. And it will be a great irony that it will be Asian American plaintiffs who are doing so. The case is brought by Ed Bloom, who collected these Asian American plaintiffs, and also has been powered by a group of Chinese first generation conservatives, most of whom are professionals and relatively affluent, who have made it their sort of cause to go after affirmative action. They're the same groups of people who went after affirmative action in San Francisco in the K-12 system, and they're now going after it in elite colleges in the United States. And their argument is that these affirmative action was put in place to help other minorities, but it's actually harming Asian Americans who are minorities too. So what I do in the piece, which came out a couple of years ago, and this is a spin-off of the current book, Asian Americans in an Anti-Black World, is look at how from the very first Supreme Court jurisprudence on this issue, which is Bakke versus University of California in 1978, until the present, what role have Asian Americans played in the Supreme Court's thinking about affirmative action? And I find, following some other scholars, that Asian Americans actually played a very pivotal role from the beginning, from that first case, Bakke. The reason they did, even though they're only mentioned in the footnotes 3 times, but only in the footnotes, not in the main text of the ruling, is because from the beginning they were seen as this anomaly. Why is it Asian Americans, who are minorities too, don't need help getting into the University of California Davis Medical School when Latinx people and Black people seem to need help to get in? Why was that? So from the very beginning, Asian Americans were used to cast doubt on affirmative action as some kind of remedial or compensatory program for racial discrimination. And so the Harvard case, which is now making its way up to the Supreme Court, is sort of a natural outgrowth of that initial logic of seeing Asian Americans in that way. The key thing to take away from this discussion in the piece about Asian Americans and affirmative action is that the premise of this discussion is that Asian Americans are equally situated with Blacks, right, or Latinx people, that they are minorities and sort of therefore fungible with these other groups. And that's why one can say, well, if Asian Americans don't need help getting into this medical school, Blacks and other groups should not need it either, right? And so what I'm trying to do in the book I'm writing now, Asian Americans in an Anti-Black World, is show there was a structural discrepancy or a structural gap between Asians and Blacks from the moment the first Chinese immigrants stepped onto the shores of California in the late 1840s. There has been a structural gap between the two positions, and that explains why we have these differential outcomes socioeconomically and otherwise over the centuries, right? So that we can't assume this very assumption that Asians are situated similarly to Blacks is a fallacy. And so the whole idea about affirmative action with Asian Americans with a relation to affirmative action is built on that fallacy, that misunderstanding.
Okay, that was a fabulous answer. It was really, really complete and just cut to the heart of lots of the debates here. I mean, if you want to say anything more about recommendations for universities such as ours when we anticipate these debates and are rethinking admissions policies, please do it. If not, I'll go on to my next question, but yeah.
I would have to know more about the sort of the legal status of these issues in Canada, which I don't know about. So I'll just speak at a very general level, not having that knowledge. Here, I think one of the frustrations people have had about affirmative action is that it's switched in that Bakke case. So it's switched from the very beginning to a rationale of promoting diversity instead of a rationale of trying to address structural inequalities that were in place because of race. And for that reason, it's been in some ways neutralized or diminished, right, in terms of what it could have done as a policy. Yeah. Not to say that diversity isn't incredibly important, right? Diversity is a goal worth defending. It just shouldn't be the only way that we are talking about race. And so in the United States, because affirmative action shifted away from its original rationale, which was more remedial or compensatory, we are now back to trying to, argue for reparations for slavery, for example, because affirmative action has gone in the direction of just being about diversity, right? And when we are in the place where we only are talking about diversity, we've already given up too much of the battle, right? We have to kind of go back and think about how much ground we've given up if that's the only thing we're talking about.
Yeah, it's true here too. I mean, what's true here is the language of diversity is still very much present, but the language of structural racism is quickly taking over. And, sort of just in standard polling, the increases in numbers of people who are using that language or familiar with it has changed a lot, but that doesn't, language at this point. But these topics are, these are really difficult topics, intellectually, emotionally, the study of race, racializing structures, conflicts. And I think a lot of graduate students, quite frankly, fear in some ways taking these topics on. And you've done this your whole career. Is there anything you can speak to just following the last discussion, which is, was so great and cogent? Anything you can speak to in your experiences about how you have taken that on yourself, how you sorted out things like what good quality scholarship means in a very, political context? Of course, you're a political scientist, so it's the nature of what you look at, or anything about how you locate yourself in those, how you find your voice in those academic debates, anything in that realm that you would like to speak to?
It made me smile, Terry, when I read your questions, especially that one, because you noted that I write a lot about tension and conflict. And I think that must be attributable to my biography in some way. Not that we need to go into that, but I know that people, many people shy away from these topics. And I think this leads into the discussion of one of your later questions about how people working on environmental issues might think more broadly about race. And so I'm hoping we can, spend a little time on that question.
Yes, absolutely, we will.
Yeah, but I did want to go back and just say one thing, because I'm not sure how comparable this is to something going on in Canada, although I know with your emphasis on multiculturalism, there may be something comparable. But in the US, since the 1960s, since our racial movements of the 1960s, the Black Power movement, Civil Rights movement, the Black Power movement, the Asian American movement, the Chicano movement, et cetera, since that time, there's been this overarching idea of all of these groups of color constituting a third world united front, right? Or people of color or third world. And this has been an incredibly powerful idea since, for the last half century. And part of the problem with this idea is that it reinforces this sense of minority fungibility, right? That all minority groups are equally situated or comparably situated. That there is no structural gap between Asians and Blacks, no way that Asians are positioned above and apart from Blacks. So I found in my work, it's very difficult to get people to think about that structural gap because they're incredibly invested in this third world coalition. And I mean, it's understandable why we're living in a period where it's more urgent than ever that these groups be able to see common ground and work together. However, my argument, again, following some scholars in Black studies, would be we can't have coalitions that are based on half truths, right? We have to actually be honest about where we're all situated as groups and have that initial honest understanding and reckoning in order to build a coalition that respects those differences and those discrepancies in power and status. Otherwise, we get very superficial, fleeting, insufficient kinds of coalitions. So I just wanted to throw that in, that's very much like the backdrop of what I'm responding to with my work, is trying to say coalition is great and coalition is important, but how do you build a working coalition or a workable coalition? You have to begin with looking at history and looking at the truth, the political truth.
Well, in some ways, I mean, the coalition point and what a kind of an honest coalition needs to look like vis-a-vis structural race. I mean, that is so at the heart of environmental politics now too, which is, as we all know, a pretty historically, in various forms of it have been quite white and other forms not. So if we're looking at the IRES community here, which is so focused on questions of environment and sustainability, a deep understanding of things like critical race theory is not necessarily widespread. It's not absent either. So any thoughts or illustrations or recommendations, anything you want to bring to bear to how understandings of critical race theory, say more broadly, and its relevance to environmental studies going on here, that we should be paying attention to, including animal-human relations, or any wading into that intersection, because I would say that, conversations that you're raising right now about coalitions, about being honest about the differences within and across, is huge. So how does that fit into the larger sustainability scholarship?
So of all your questions, I felt like this was sort of the central one for our day, that if there's anything I get across to you all, if there's anything that's sort of a takeaway, I hope it'll be my answer to this question. So I'm going to come at it from a couple different directions, and please bear with me because it's not necessarily all fitting together. But so you asked me to use, Terry, some specific examples as much as I could when I'm speaking. When we're thinking about why people working on environmental issues should think about race, I'll give you the first and most important example, empirical example that occurs to me, and that is what's going on right now in the election, right? The fact that Donald Trump was elected 4 years ago and is this close to being reelected again, I think has everything to do with race. There's no way to explain the election of Donald Trump in 2016 without understanding it as part of a white backlash to 8 years under our first Black president. That is, I think, sort of an undeniable aspect of what went on in 2016 and what we've all been living with since. And so for any of us who think Donald Trump has had an impact on how the United States and therefore the world engages in, fighting climate disaster or trying to save the planet, I think we all would say, yes, that he has had an enormous impact. That is something that is directly tied to race, right? So if you're interested in climate disaster and mass extinctions, et cetera, you have to be interested in race, because what happened with the election of Donald Trump is about race. But I also wanted to go to a point about thinking about the environment, thinking about ecology, people often say, well, this is something that involves the whole planet. This is something that involves all of humanity. We're all in this together. We're all in the same boat, right? We're all on the same one planet. And I think that sort of universalizing, generalizing thinking, it's very appealing in some ways, and one can understand it from a strategic point of view, but it's very misleading as well. We're not, in fact, all in this together. We are, the world is fractured very deeply by class and race and by many other divisions as well, but I'm going to focus on class and race for a moment. And so everything that happens in terms of the environment is happening and landing on groups differently because of these racial and class fractures. And so, this is one reason that some scholars don't like referring to the period that we're in as the Anthropocene, because the Anthropocene suggests, right, that it's humanity that has brought us to this, that has damaged the planet and brought us to this, to the brink of extinction. And so many critics, including those in Black studies, would say it wasn't humanity, in fact, right? It was capitalism working in tandem with race. And so for purposes of simplicity, I'm just going to use the term racial capitalism from Cedric Robinson to suggest capitalism that works, that is very deeply imbricated with racial categories. There are a lot of interesting debates about whether racial capitalism is a good term, because one thing I don't like about it is it seems to suggest that race and capitalism are one system, right? And so in that sense, it can seem to reduce race to capitalism, which I don't think we should do. I think we have to understand them as imbricated but distinct systems. So, but I'm going to use the term racial capitalism for simplicity's sake. So if racial capitalism has created, right, has been sort of the root cause of the environmental disaster and sort of danger that we're in right now, then there's no way to address that without addressing race, right? I mean, without addressing race and without addressing capitalism. So I think it's vital, and this goes back to your question about not wanting to think about racial issues because they're difficult, they're painful. Also, for those of us who weren't trained in this, it seems very daunting. Like, where do you begin to start thinking about race? So I actually do have a couple suggestions for readings at the end, but I don't think there's any way to avoid it. If we look at any given city, we know, right, from environmental justice literatures that environmental harms fall disproportionately on poor and communities of color, right, in any given city. If we go back, bring the camera back within any given nation, right, any so-called natural disasters, Hurricane Katrina or the pandemic going on right now, these events fall more heavily on groups of color, particularly in the United States, on Black populations, poor Black populations. If we pull back the camera even further and look at the globe, the impact of climate disaster has been disproportionately heavy, right, for areas of the world which are so-called third world areas, which are impoverished and now dealing with drought and storms and other kinds of disasters, even more than those of us in other parts of the world. So it's to talk about the threat of human extinction, to talk about climate disaster without making race a central part of that conversation, I think is to sort of miss what is really going on, and to sort of condemn oneself to irrelevance from the beginning. And so I wanted to bring up, since Terry, you talked about specific examples, that I was in a virtual symposium recently, which was one of my first attempts to sort of talk to a group of, I was just one of many people participating, but talking to a group of people. I'm not going to say where it was, except to say it was also part of the former British Empire. Talking to a group of people who were concerned with climate, with animals, and also with race. And my sense coming out of that conversation was that race was very much sidelined, that to the degree that it made it into the conversation at all, it was about indigeneity. And then even with indigeneity, it was sort of lip service to indigenous perspectives more than a really deep engagement with indigenous perspectives, which might not be as straightforward or as simple as one might think. So my contribution to that discussion was to say, if we think of racial capitalism as being a root cause of the kinds of disasters and dangers that we are facing now, then who is addressing racial capitalism? Who has the history of addressing racial capitalism? And that brought me to the Black liberation struggle, right, which in the United States has occurred since the time of slavery, before the founding of the nation until the present, right, in various instantiations over time. But if we look at the Black liberation struggle, there have been moments in that struggle which were truly radical, where they were addressing race and capitalism at the same time. I'll give you one example. The Black Panther Party, which I'm sure most of you have heard of, in the 1960s, was not the first Black radical group in the US to do this, but it was an important Black radical group that saw anti-Blackness or racism as tied inextricably to capitalism. And so they called for a socialist society where racial distinctions wouldn't necessarily disappear, but would no longer be tied to the maldistribution of wealth and resources, right? So my contribution to the symposium was to say, what if we thought of Black Lives Matter as the most promising site for thinking about environmental issues, for addressing environmental issues, because it addresses racial capitalism in a way that other kinds of movements and other efforts do not. And so that suggestion didn't seem to have a lot of, get a lot of reaction, or it didn't seem to have traction in that discussion, but I did find it important to try to introduce that that idea to that group. But also here I would want to say, there are a couple of authors I have in mind whom I've begun to read. I'm by no means really an expert on these authors, but Catherine McKittrick, Catherine Yusoff, and Sylvia Wynter, three Black feminists working on the intersection of many things, but among many things, among other things, Blackness and geography and environment and nature, etc. So those are three, places to start.
No, that's great. And again, a great answer. And here a lot of the conversation is Black capitalism, but also colonial capitalism, and partly because of being in BC. And, a lot of the things you mentioned are very loud and very problematic in those discussions here too, including the kind of marginalization of that central focus and what could be that central focus. And also the naive expectations of groups as well, the expectation that or the imagining of First Nation communities as not being in the city when they are, as expecting, some romantic notion of what the ideal utopic future might be that they might drive for your behalf. All of those things, those conversations are ongoing here. Although, yeah, I can let students bring up those questions too, but that rings very true here, I have to say, in all of those points, and they're great points. I think, Rudri, are we out of time? If you want to, we should turn over to students, but I think the one thing, because we're such a mixed audience, if you have any closing thoughts on, but I think you've really covered this, is, we are all sort of trained into our fields and socialized into our fields, and for non-political scientists or even non-social scientists in the audience, is there anything else you want to say about things we should understand about racial politics? I think you've covered that key thing about how Black capitalism, colonial capitalism is in some ways the intersection and the way forward. But anything you want to sort of wrap up with there in terms of speaking to audiences like ours before I turn over the mic, so to speak?
Well, I would just start with one thing, which is I don't consider myself a political scientist. I'm trained in political science, but I don't believe that politics is susceptible to the scientific method. I don't believe that it's something that should be studied through the testing of hypotheses. So, it's hard to believe we live in a time where I actually have to affirm this out loud, but I do want to affirm. I believe in science. I believe science is a good thing, and I believe in scientific truths. However, I don't believe the study of human behavior, and particularly in politics, should be studied that way. And so this leads us to, right, if we want to get into discussions about methodology, right, in political science, are you a quantitative person or are you a non-quantitative person? Being a non-quantitative person means you're subject to criticisms for being not rigorous, not scientific, right? And so it's all about, for me, that's why I don't like the term political science. I don't believe I'm doing science. I don't believe one can do what I'm doing and do it scientifically. And I also want to push back a little against those in my field, and this is, of course, the center of gravity in my field, who think that quantitative methods are the only way one can understand anything about politics or human behavior. So, um, right, so that's just a little plug for those of you who are wondering about your own relationship to science in your work, right? And how much are you in the interpretive mode? How much are you in the scientific mode? So that's just a little commentary on that. But I think these, yeah, so the two takeaways I hope from my brief comments today are one, thinking about the structural advantage that non-Black groups have in the United States relative to Blacks, right? That there is something distinctive and historically specific about the Black status of Black people in the United States that comes from the experience of racial slavery here. And that other groups have, and this is what I'm going to be arguing in my book, is have had a structural advantage from the beginning and are sort of recruited into an anti-Black racial order, into supporting it in certain ways and in testifying for it in certain ways. And I think that that's so important for us to know so that we don't think that, again, that all racialized groups in the US have it the same, that we're all sort of equally positioned, equally subordinated. Because I think, and again, this is why I go back over and over to Black Lives Matter as the movement that I see that is naming that specificity in a way that other movements are not. And I also want to say that even though you're in Canada, and or many of you are in Canada, and Canada doesn't have the history of plantation slavery, has much different and much smaller experience with slavery. I do believe, based on things that I've read in Black studies, that anti-Blackness is a global phenomenon. So it's not something that one could just say,
Yeah,
that's
absolutely.
because they had plantation slavery. It's just Brazil or it's just Haiti. And so, part of what I'm doing in the book right now is when I talk about Chinese and Korean and Japanese immigrants coming to the United States, I don't spend much time on this, but there's a little bit of time I spend on saying what were people in those countries thinking about Blackness at the moment they're migrating to the United States. So I do
Yeah,
spend some time, and part of this is a story about how Western race discourses have, by the 1800s, really gone into China and Japan, and those discourses then move into Korea right through in the 1900s through colonialism. So, but I'm seeing the impact of anti-Black thought and practice in Asia and influencing the migrants who then come to the United States and find it here all over again, right? So again,
yeah,
these sort of
yeah.
transnational and global flows of anti-Blackness.
Yeah, again, really well put, particularly on the anti-Black thought and flows of that in the kind of history of imperialism and capitalism more broadly. And also that I take to great heart your point about political, not science, as someone who's always thought, how can you compare two countries as defensible units for quantitative analysis, among other things, but I won't go there. So appreciate that very much. Excuse me, let me move on to, I think it's time to open the questions to the House, and I'm going to designate two student questions first because they came in very early. So I'll turn the mic over. Ta, if you can turn your mic on, and we'll take it from there.
Yeah, thank you so much,
Thank
Dr.
you,
Kim,
Claire.
for your insightful, explanations about like the various parts of your work. I guess my question shifts the conversation a little bit to COVID, and I like to ask, so the COVID-19 pandemic presents another case where we see the workings of this, the taxonomies of race and species in full force, and you've mentioned that briefly earlier, and also it's kind of came out in your book, Dangerous Crossings. So what are your thoughts on how to bring, topics of race and species into conversation to dismantle both white supremacy and human supremacy, especially when we're so conditioned to think of them as like unrelated and separate issues.
Right. So I just want to take 1 second to say, Layla, I'm so happy your dog finds what I'm saying interesting, because I can see, I can see I'm holding their attention. Right. So COVID, I think of as a kind of an accelerated, if we think of this in terms of temporality, and it's an accelerated lesson, master lesson. But then, right, climate crisis is sort of the more protracted, but also accelerating master lesson about the intersection of these things, right? Race, capitalism, species, nature. And so I think with COVID, we see, right, that capitalism is clearly playing a central role here with the the way that pandemics are emerging, both from, in this case, probably from the wildlife trade in China, but also, as we know in the past, from the raising of domesticated animals in industrial farming. So we see the impact of capitalism working with or enabled by various ideologies, right, about how the human relates to nature, how the human relates to the animal, how the human relates to racialized others, or the racialized others who are now being suffering the most under the pandemic. And so the question becomes how to look at those root causes, right? Capitalism enabled by this constellation of ideologies, and challenge those things, because simply doing things like trying to shut down the wildlife trade or regulate the wildlife trade in China, or creating slightly different conditions on industrial farms within the United States, right? These are not these. This is sort of tinkering around the edges when we know that what we need, in fact, is something quite dramatic and something quite fundamental in terms of change. Otherwise, we know there will be future pandemics, some of which may be more lethal than this one. And we know that we're already, even without the pandemics, going off the cliff, right, in terms of the climate disasters. So without looking at those root causes, it's hard to imagine we're ever going to put ourselves in a better position. But in terms of thinking about race and animality together, as you mentioned, they're usually talked about as separate things. Although there is sort of a group of sort of young, exciting Black scholars who are starting to look at some of those connections in the U.S. Joshua Bennett, Zakiya Jackson are a few of them, AFCO. And so one of the pieces I wrote, Todd, I don't know if you've read the piece on Harambe. Did you see that piece?
No, I don't think so.
So that was a piece I wrote a few years ago that came out of a institute on race and animals that I co-organized with a few colleagues at Wesleyan University. And that institute was in 2016. And our purpose was to say, people are not talking about race and species, even though these things are profoundly linked. So how can we advance that conversation? So that this piece I wrote on the killing of the gorilla Harambe in the Cincinnati Zoo came out of that workshop or that institute. And what I argue in this piece, which is different from what I argue in Dangerous Crossings, because it's a couple years later and my thinking is kind of moving along, is that we construct the human, right, at the as in opposition to not only this idea of the slave or the black, but also in opposition to the idea of the animal. So I'm kind of trying to bring together two literatures here. The literature's on literature in animal studies, which says the human is constructed vis-a-vis the animal, and the literature in black studies, which says the human is constructed vis-a-vis the black, right? So it's bringing these two together by saying actually the human is constructed by reference to these 2 points, right? So you could think of sort of a triangle, and that they're also, therefore, the animal and the black, and I use the term the black on purpose to sort of designate a degendered, right, sort of figure of the slave. So blackness and animality, I argue in this piece, are also very, very closely co-constituted. And one could talk about that for a long time, right? The persistence of the comparison to apes, right? That we see, the comparison of blacks or Africans to apes throughout Western history. President Obama, for example, and Michelle Obama were lampooned using ape caricatures in the U.S. press.
Mhm.
So this is an idea that persists. So looking at race and animality as very much connected, and then thinking about the human as defined in relation to that sort of closed loop between animal and black, animal and black. And so that's what I did in that piece. And I think the relevance here is that in addition to thinking about the role of capitalism in COVID, we need to be thinking about how the idea of the human defines which beings are worthwhile, which beings matter, which beings are grievable, and which beings are not, right? And COVID clearly shows us the cost or the consequences of designating most animals on the globe, on the planet, aside from ourselves, as fully dispensable, as not grievable, but also huge swaths of human populations as not grievable. And in the US, things have gotten so extreme with COVID that even those designated as mattering the most, namely white Americans, even white Americans, like huge numbers of white Americans, as we know, tens, if not hundreds of thousands eventually, are being sacrificed, right? People who are in certain kinds of jobs, whether they're healthcare workers or they're grocery delivery people, right? They're sort of thrown into the sacrifice zone. So even those that matter the most, when we're talking about enabling sort of the endless accumulation of profit on the part of capitalism, um, will be discarded. And I think one really good example of that from the United States is when Donald Trump ordered meatpacking workers in the U.S. South to go back to work, even though they were being exposed in very high rates to COVID in the workplace, right? And they were primarily African American women who were poor, right, working at these jobs where they're slaughtering and processing chickens, for example. He ordered them to go back to work and at the same time made sure that their employers, right, the meat industry, would be legally protected from any lawsuits that might come from employees saying to them, you exposed us to COVID and you endangered us, right? So this is about capital. This is about protecting the prerogatives of capital. This is about designating certain populations as not worthy, as not grievable, as not mattering. And those populations include both animals and human others.
Yeah, thank you so much.
Yeah, again, great and thorough and deep answer to that question. Just really fabulous. Rudri, I think you're up next on the question front. Do you want to step in?
Sure. Thank you, Dr. Kim, for the very thought-provoking answers. I wanted to ask I was curious to know that this year got about a major Black Lives Matter movement. So how do the recent events shape your work moving forward? And if you've noticed significant differences now compared to historic movements?
What a great question. I think one has to situate Black Lives Matter as they situate themselves, the activists in the movement, within this long Black freedom struggle, right? Going back to what would become the U.S. back to the 1600s, when the first slaves were brought to Jamestown, Virginia. So I think one has to situate it in that very long, centuries-long Black freedom struggle. The activists in the movement read about, reference, talk about being inspired by earlier leaders, and we can see the continuity in thought and practice, right, over the centuries. At the same time, there are some really interesting differences, which are exciting, I think, to many of us, including the fact that the three founders of Black Lives Matter originally were women, queer Black women. And so they have foregrounded from the beginning issues of gender and sexuality and in a way that has not been foregrounded in earlier phases of the Black liberation struggle. They've also talked about capitalism and to some degree ecological issues in ways that haven't always been done in or pre-modeled in other phases of the struggle. So I think there are some really important continuities and some important differences. one thing that I found when I was being interviewed over the summer by sort of mainstream media in the US, they wanted to know, is it really new that the movement in the streets right after the murder of George Floyd seems multiracial? Like we have more white people, we have more Asian people, we have more Latinx people. How important is this? How different is this? Is this like marking the turn toward a less black movement, exclusively black movement, and a more multiracial movement? And this is in some ways tied to another one of the student questions for today, which was, have Asian Americans become better allies to Black Lives Matter, and how are they relating to anti-blackness? So it's related to that question. But my sense when I was answering these journalist questions was, it's far too early to say that this has now become a multiracial movement, right? There is something about the George Floyd murder which touched a nerve, or it touched people in the United States and around the world, really, in ways that other murders of Black people by the police have not necessarily. And so there's clearly some kind of connecting, some kind of outpouring, some kind of recognition. But, history would teach us that's not necessarily going to last, for one thing. And nor is it necessarily connected to an acceptance of the kind of fundamental critique that Black Lives Matter activists are making about the US, or at least the more radical ones among them. So, for example, on the street on any given day, you might have a wide range of people, Black and non-Black, who have very different ideas about the police, right? Some want to create more police reform. Some want to defund the police and shift the money over to social programs. Some connect the eradication of the police, right, to abolitionism and sort of dismantling the carceral state, right? So there are a lot of different political positions reflected within the movement itself, among Black participants in the movement, and then also when you sort of fan out and say, well, there are all these multiracial participants now, that sort of further dilutes or further complicates the political complexity of the movement.
Mm-hmm. We've almost seen some waxing and waning of that over just the last 4 months or so. Again, thank you. Great answer. I'll go on to Milind. He's had his question from faculty, and then I'm going to go back to some of the student questions that I've got on my docket here. You're on mute, Milind. You need to unmute.
There's a historian, philosopher, Noel Ignatieff, a little bit controversial. He asserts in his book how the Irish became white, that new Irish immigrants achieved acceptance among an initially hostile white population only by proving that they could match the nativists or worse in oppressing African Americans. To what extent does that dynamic play itself out today when it comes to relationships between other communities of color and African Americans?
Yeah, that's a great question. And it's related to the comment sometimes people make, which is that Asian Americans are becoming white. And that is something that I disagree with. So let me explain why. So that the phenomenon, the dynamic that Noel Ignatieff and others like David Roediger identify, I think is absolutely correct. Also Matthew Jacobson, that white immigrants coming into the country, including Jews, Italians, and others, historically in the United States have become white through distancing from Blackness. And one of the most concrete examples I can give you of that is blackface minstrelsy, right? Which was typically performed by Irish and Jewish performers. And they were sort of considered liminal whites. And by putting on blackface and then taking it off, right, by mimicking and caricaturing and ridiculing Black people, they brought themselves closer to whiteness, closer to white acceptance. So I do think there's a way in which those white immigrant groups became what we now consider white, became fully white in some ways. They're still considered ethnic, but they became white racially. I think a similar thing is happening to Asian Americans, but it's also different. So to use Asian Americans as an example, Latinx people are slightly different because, of course, they are technically considered white in the U.S. Census, and that there's a different history with that than with Asian Americans. So that's sort of a separate conversation. But for Asian Americans, there is a strong similarity to that white immigrant story. And the similarity is that Asian Americans too, from the moment they arrive in the US, I think the most constitutive feature one can identify about them is that they are understood to be not Black. They are also understood to be not white, but they are primarily understood to be not Black. And through in my book, what I really try to show is all the ways that their not Blackness shape their experience and their status from the beginning, right? And as having a certain kind of privilege. Again, relative to whites, they're not white and therefore they have various kinds of disadvantage. But historians have primarily focused on that disadvantage that Asians have relative to whites. And they have not focused on, at the same time, these kinds of structural advantage Asians have had over Blacks. So the reason that I think that the Asian story is different than the white immigrant story is that I think it actually serves whites to keep Asians as a group that is understood to be a racial minority, for the reasons that I explained earlier, which is the best way that Asians have served the racial state in the United States is to be an example, and this is related to the whole model minority idea, to be an example of a group that has been discriminated against as a racial minority and is still making it, right? They're still like thriving in capitalism. Of course, this is an exaggeration and somewhat of a distortion, but compared to Blacks, they are still making it. They're still getting great jobs. Their education rates are even better than whites. Their median family income is higher than that of whites. So they are sort of poster children for racial capitalism, and they serve a function as a racialized minority group. So to the degree that you absorb Asians into whiteness and no longer consider them white, you lose that incredibly powerful ideological function that Asians and Latinx people can perform, which is to provide to serve as false witnesses for the racial state.
Yeah, both that false witness and the non-Blackness points are just, yeah, again, fabulous there. I mean, just cuts to the chase of those dynamics so well. I think we have time for a few more questions. Emmanuel, you're up next, I think. I'm sorry, everyone, I'm working from both one-on-one receiving of questions and broader chat ones. And if we have time, I think it would be Harold and Nigel, but we'll just see how we go here. Emmanuel, do you want to take over the mic?
Yeah, sure. Thanks, Terry, and thank you, Claire. It's been really fascinating to hear you answer all these questions. So my question is kind of, it's not exactly related to, specifically related to your work, but it's more broad in terms of what I've observed and from many readings I've done in this issue, which is like, do history lessons really prevent someone from being a racist, rather than having or maintaining genuine, sustained personal relationships with racialized people?
Well, I wish history lessons prevented. That would make things a lot easier. Well, yeah. So Terry sent me one version of this question that you had posed, and I think my first response was history is written from the perspective of the winners, right? I mean, the perspective of the conquerors. So the question is, which history is getting taught in a history lesson? And this is to go back to the Black Panthers. This is why the Panthers in the 60s and 70s formed liberation schools, where they could teach children in Black communities a different kind of history than the one that's being taught to them in the U.S. public schools, a history that actually talked about anti-Black racism and that didn't sort of engage in, national mythologies about the U.S. and its overcoming of its racial problems. So, the first question is, who's defining the history? Whose history is being taught? And it's almost always, right, just by virtue of how power works, what's being taught in the schools is the perspective of the powerful, the perspective of capital, and the perspective of whites in the U.S. So history is always, the teaching of history, the learning of history is always going to be a site of the most intense contestation, right? There's no getting around that. And once history becomes, reaches the point where it's actually taught in the schools, let's say it were begun as in the liberation schools, taught by the Black Panthers, and somehow a society was created where that history was then being taught as the main history in schools, it would be hard to imagine that that history wouldn't in turn become some kind of orthodoxy that would need to be challenged, right? So that's kind of one of the internal contradictions or dilemmas. But to give you a specific example, there's a controversy now in the United States over the 1619 Project. I don't know how many of you have been reading about it. The New York Times, which is one of our leading newspapers, mainstream newspapers, came up with this 1619 Project to mark the year when African slaves were first brought to the Jamestown colony. And so this has turned into a very broad project, educational project, to try to sort of refocus our historical attention on the centrality of slavery in the history of the United States. And this has brought out, by Trump and many people who are similar to Trump in their perspective, has brought out just a lot of vitriol, because their argument is, if we focus on slavery, we are anti-patriotic. Like we are showing we don't really like the United States. We think the United States is trash if we're talking about slavery and we're trying to get people to focus on that. Let's instead, I think Trump talked about, he's formed a commission to come up with an alternative curriculum that would be like a patriotic curriculum that would focus on the greatness of the United States, right? So even a project which seeks to say, these are the facts, right? This is the fact of what happened. This has been whitewashed in public education and private education in the United States. I'm a product of both public and private education in the United States. I can tell you what I learned about slavery in my history classes could be fit into one paragraph, right? So it's a project that's saying we are a country shaped by, that continues to be shaped by slavery, which many would argue has not ended in the United States or elsewhere. And so even an attempt to say that, right, is taken up by the right as anti-patriotic, as America-hating. So that would, give you some sense. I think that's a confirmation of my point about the contestations about history.
Yeah, again, and having very much those conversations on history and curriculum here with regard to race and with regard to colonialism in particular. Okay, everything is going to get painful here as we're running out of time, and there's a backlog of great questions. And I realized, Dana, I missed your question earlier, so I think we should jump to Dana, and then if we have time, back to the prior list of Harold and Nigel. And see, it is 1:35, and Claire, you're probably becoming a bit hoarse from this conversation, but it's too wonderful. I'm having trouble putting it down. Dana, go ahead. We'll see how we go.
Thank you so much, Terry and Dr. Kim. My question is just really brief, I think. I was just wondering about your reflections on the term the Plantationocene, and if you feel like that's sort of a fitting way to frame the Anthropocene instead, or what other sort of terms you might gravitate towards. You mentioned racial capitalism, but just your thoughts on that would be welcome.
That question, Dana. Yeah, I'm thinking back to an exchange I read between Donna Haraway and Anna Singh on that term. Have you seen that piece?
Yes.
Yes. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So it's a great question, and what I like is the idea. I'm pretty sure they talked about in this piece of thinking of the Plantationocene as just one way of referring to this period, right? So it's a term that brings out certain aspects of the period, but it doesn't have to be the exclusive term. It doesn't have to replace other terms that we might think, Capitalocene or other related terms, right? We could think of these all as being true together. I like Plantationocene for the reason that it makes slavery central to her understanding of this not only historical and political era, but of this ecological and geological era, right? So I really appreciate that it does that, the term. And I appreciate Haraway and Singh, the way that they talk about the plantation, not only in the ways you and I would expect, right? In terms of land use and environmental impact and racial impact, but also about the animals, right? Who are impacted by the planting of crops in that particular fashion, and the way that it changes, right? The sort of structure of animal life in plantation economy. So I think it's a very generative term. I again appreciate the sort of things that it's centering, and I like it as a term that goes hand in hand with other terms. It doesn't necessarily replace other terms.
Thanks.
Yeah, and that was very much the spirit of their paper too. Let's see, I think we can, in all fairness to you, just go with one more question, and apologies for those who are lined up here. And I think, Layla, were you trying to get mine? Did I miss another question, or were you just waiting? I was going to move over to Harold's question, and then I think we should probably wrap up. We're treating you unfairly.
No, I'm enjoying it. Thank you.
Yeah, me too. Yeah. Harold.
Thank you so much, Claire. This has been one of the most thought-provoking seminars I think many of us have been to. So thank you so much. Kind of going off of your answer to Todd's question, and talking about these dual kind of human supremacy and white supremacy, do you see those as kind of like where white supremacy helps to subordinate animals and human supremacy helps to subordinate humans? Do you see, other humans, do you see that those as kind of pretty parallel and similar, or are there important distinctions about the ways that those two things operate? Does one preempt the other one, or are they mutually kind of constitutive? I don't know if you could talk about that.
Do you mean, do I see human supremacy and white supremacy as equally important or as separate? I'm not quite sure I'm getting the question.
Yeah. So do you see human supremacy as enabling white supremacy, and the same way that white supremacy enables human supremacy, or do you see those two processes as pretty different?
So I guess
the way they're used,
I would go back to what I said about the Harambe article, in that I really see defining the human as, on the one hand, against the animal, and on the other hand, against the black, really brings white supremacy and human supremacy together, right? And sort of sees them as inextricably linked, and as always.
Right, but so you see them as kind of being parallel, and
well, I don't see them as
similar
in the way they act. Right? So parallel would mean that they are running side by side, right? But I see them as sort of one always involves the other. But one way I wanted to answer your question, because I also saw an earlier version of it from Terry, was to say that in some ways, if we look at the Black liberation struggle, to go back to that, let's look at abolitionism, right? In the 17 and 1800s, before the U.S. Civil War, abolitionists, there was a very famous image that abolitionists in Britain and the U.S. used of a kneeling male slave, and he was chained, right? And his hands are raised, and the slogan was, "Am I not a man and a brother?" Right? So that slogan reminds us that that abolitionists tried to appeal to the American public to remind them that slaves too, that black people too, were people, right? That they were humans, that a black male slave was a man, just the way that a white man was a man. And so they were appealing to this idea, in part because chattel slavery, of course, involved abjecting the slave into a creature or an entity that one would think is more similar to furniture, right, movable property, or on the other hand, to an animal, to livestock. Slaves were often compared to livestock. There were a lot of ways that the treatment of slaves lined up with the treatment of livestock under slavery. For example, sometimes slaves were fed in the same trough with pigs, right? The food was thrown into the trough, and slaves were expected to eat out of it with pigs. That's just one example. There was an appeal to sort of recognizing slaves as human, and this, of course, plays into ideas of humans being different from, apart from, and superior to animals, right? So this is one reason why arguments about race and species today get so complicated. So I know that Terry had mentioned in one of her questions to me this PETA exhibit that I talked about, where it was from the early 2000s, and I believe it was called "We Are All Animals," and it was PETA's attempt to link animal oppression to black oppression. And it involved, for example, it was a traveling exhibit that involved huge panels, which were split in two. And on one side, they showed like a Black person suffering oppression. On the other side, they showed an animal suffering oppression. So, and this was, the reaction of many, let's say, Black student groups on campuses when they saw this exhibit coming through their university was to say, you're comparing us to animals, right? You're lowering us to the status of animals. If this is a split screen and it's an animal and a Black person, in the white person's imagination, this is confirming what they already know, right? That Black people are on the same level with animals. So there was a lot of controversy about the event, and PETA's response was, well, we're just trying to show that oppression and suffering happens for all beings, regardless of species category. And we're not trying in any way to put down Black people. But this is an example that shows sort of the difficulty and how really fraught and I think actually impossible it is to talk about Blackness and animality without reproducing anti-Black ideas. And I say this because as someone who I wrote the piece on Harambe where I was talking about the co-constitution of Blackness and animality. I took it to various venues, including Montreal. I went to Concordia in Montreal to give this talk. And I remember, without going into detail, there was someone in the audience who was distressed by the talk. And she really believed that I was reproducing the association of animality and Blackness. And in a certain way I was, right? As a non-Black person going into a mostly non-Black venue and putting up pictures of gorillas and sketches of Africans and talking about Blackness and animality, it helped to convince me, not just that one experience, but many experiences where I just thought more deeply about it. It helped to convince me that there's just something impossible about talking about this issue, even though it's necessary to talk about it. Because I do believe there is something really fundamentally linked about these two ideas that we need to get to if we're going to understand COVID and climate crisis, et cetera. But it's politically impossible and it's extremely painful for some people, right? It's like the infliction of harm on people to do this. So I'm just going to leave that there because I really think I don't want to tie it up for you in a bow, right? I want you to see it's complicated, it's fraught, it's not resolvable. I'm not sure I want to talk about that piece anymore. My next book is actually going to go back to race, animals, and ecology. I want to sort of expand that Harambe piece, but I'm thinking about how I might do that in a way that doesn't sort of reproduce the very problem I'm trying to address.
Claire, I think we have to wind down, but it's interesting that we're ending here because the Harambe piece of all of them is the one that just comes back to me over and over again for exactly the reasons you're mentioning, I think. And to everyone on this, in this gathering, please have a deep look into Claire's work. It's really fabulous. As you can see from her answers to these questions, there's just no skirting around the complexities of the intersection of communities of color, Black capitalism, animality, all of these pieces are just kind of alive and so thoughtfully treated. And you can see from her answers that that is not surprising. Claire, this was thrilling to be a part of. I can't thank you enough. And can we all clap silently or out loud as we do on these
much.
calls? Yeah, thank you.
Really wonderful. And I've enjoyed our exchanges. And thank you so much to all of you. Great questions. And it's been very fun for me. So thank you.
Yeah, I hope when all of this madness settles that we can have you up here in person and carry on this conversation in whatever ways we can in the meantime.
I'd love it. Thank you.
Again, 1,000 thank yous. And thanks everyone.
Pray for us down in the US.
We are, yeah. Okay.
Almost
Bye-bye.
there, almost there.
Yeah.
Almost there. All right. Bye.
Okay, thank you again.